Wilderness experiences have a way of stripping away so many things in our lives that we thought were really important, even indispensable. How many things have we lost or had taken away from us by this COVID-19 induced wilderness we're going through? One of the greatest longings that I've heard by people who've felt that they've lost a lot in this time has been that having to do with relationships or friendships that have been impacted by the separations. It's kind of ironic that it's often in the toughest of times that we discover who our true friends are. And as I've noted before, one of the things that God has been speaking to me about during this time has been His desire that we would use this time of forced stillness to get to know Him better, to learn to be His friends. So we're taking several weeks to consider what it means to be a true friend of God, looking first at, as we did last week and this week, at two people who were mentioned as friends of God. We'll be looking at David, who God Himself called a man after my own heart. And then we'll also look at what Jesus had to say about what He thinks it means for us to be His friends. Last week, we learned from Abraham that being a friend of God involves learning to trust Him and then to do whatever He asks us to do, even when we can't figure out how we can work it out or God can work it out. Today, we're going to be looking at the life of Moses, who's probably the clearest example of a true friendship with God by a human being. Like Abraham, he didn't start out as a friend of God. Rather, as Exodus chapter 2, verse 11 to 21 shows us, early on, Moses was caught up with his own Messiah complex, taking matters into his own hands when he saw an Egyptian beating one of his fellow Israelites. Verse 12 says that looking this way and looking that, and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian, and he hid him in the sand. But as so often happens, word got out, and Moses had to flee to the backside of the desert to escape the threat of being killed by Pharaoh himself. As it turned out, that literal wilderness is what shaped him to be a friend of God. Let me say it again. That literal wilderness turned out to be what shaped Moses into being a friend with God. Why do I say that? Because it was there in that foreign land, as Moses called it, that in that wilderness that Moses met and was mentored by a man named Jethro, who would become his father-in-law. Jethro, we're told in verse 16, was a priest of Midian. That's the country to which Moses had fled. We're also told that Jethro's last name, his family name, was Rehuel, which means friend of God. Moses stayed with him, watching his flocks for him as his son-in-law for the next 40 years before God called him. And in that time, he learned from this friend of God what it meant to be a friend of God. In addition, we'll see later that Moses clearly listened to and followed Jethro's advice, even when Moses himself was the leader of all Israel. It seems that as a result of hanging around and learning from this man named Friend of God, Moses came to learn what it meant to be God's friend. And I think that's probably something that would be good for us to keep in mind as we seek to grow as friends of God. That what will help us is by hanging around other people who are friends of God. So what did Moses' friendship with God look like? From several passages in Exodus, as well as also from Numbers and Deuteronomy, we notice the character of their friendship. In Exodus chapter 33, verses 7 through 11, the passage in which Moses is actually referred to as a friend of God, we see two key characteristics of their relationship. First of all, the first characteristic is that Moses spent a lot of time with God. It actually makes sense because spending time together is a key way to build any friendship. Exodus chapter 33, verses 7 through 11 puts it this way. Now Moses used to take a tent and pitch it outside the camp some distance away, calling it the tent of meeting. Anyone inquiring of the Lord would go to the tent of meeting outside of the camp. And whenever Moses went out to the tent, all the people rose and stood at the entrance of their tents, watching Moses until he entered the tent. As Moses went into the tent, the pillar of cloud, which had led them through the wilderness, would come down and stay at the entrance while the Lord spoke with Moses. Whenever the people saw the pillar of cloud standing above the entrance of the tent, they all stood and worshiped, each at the entrance of their own tent. Then Moses would return to the camp, but his young aide, Joshua the son of Nun, did not leave the tent. It was Moses' habit, his custom, to go out to the tent and meet with God. So much so that if anyone wanted to inquire of God through Moses, which we learn later in Exodus chapter 18, verses 13 to 16, that they did quite a bit of, they had to go out to the tent of meeting where they would usually find Moses. We also see numerous examples of other specific instances of Moses hanging out with God throughout the book of Exodus, including a 40-day retreat with God on Mount Sinai when God gave Moses his laws and his commandments so that Moses could instruct his people. And that's recorded for us in Exodus chapter 24, verses 12 through 8, where it says that he stayed on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. A long time just hanging out with God. If we want to be a friend of God, there is no substitute for spending time alone with Him. Then secondly, the second characteristic of Moses' friendship with God has to do with the way in which Moses talked with God. For you see, in the way that he talked to God, we see Moses' heart toward God. Exodus chapter 33, the first part of verse 11 says about the times when Moses met with God at the tent of meeting, that the Lord would speak to Moses face to face as one speaks to a friend. In Numbers chapter 12, verses 6 through the first part of verse 8, God himself puts it this way, talking to Miriam and Aaron, "When there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, reveal myself to them in visions. I speak to them in dreams. But this is not true of my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my household. With him I speak face to face, clearly and not in riddles. He sees the form of God." This is God speaking. He is my friend. That's how I talk to him. God confided in Moses as one would confide in a true friend. And there's a frankness on both his and Moses' parts in the way that they talk with one another, recorded throughout Exodus all the way to Deuteronomy. In fact, it is in Moses' words to God that we see how Moses felt about God. In particular, we notice three things that Moses cared about most in his friendship with God. You see, what stands out again and again, first of all, is that Moses cared about God's reputation far more than he did even about his own. Moses cared far more about God's reputation than he did about his own. In Exodus chapter 32, verse 12, when God confided to Moses that he wanted to destroy the Israelites after they committed idolatry, worshiping the golden calf and rejecting God while Moses was up with God on the mountain, God said that he would also make Moses a great nation. He said, I'm going to destroy them, but I'll make you into a great nation. Instead, Moses seeks to talk God out of it, saying, why should the Egyptians say it was with an evil intent that God brought them out, to kill them in the mountains and to wipe them off the face of the earth? Later, as Moses himself recounted his conversation with God to the people, he states that he said to God that if God wiped these people out, the country from which you brought us will say, because the Lord was not able to take them to the land that he promised them, and because he hated them, he brought them out to put them to death in the wilderness. As a friend of God, Moses knew God's character. And he was concerned that if God killed all of these people for their wickedness, others would not attribute it to God's holiness. But instead, they would interpret it as showing that God was instead either a wicked God or a weak God, secretly trying to kill them and to cover up his own wickedness and weakness in the desert. By the way, that's much like what Moses did with the body of the Egyptian that he killed and buried in the desert. Moses was concerned that people wouldn't understand and would impugn God's character. Moses wanted he wanted other people to see God for who he was, regardless of whether or not it would make Moses look good. He refused to prosper where doing so would call God's character into question. No, I don't want you to make me a great nation. I care about your character. Secondly, Moses cared about the things that were important to God, the things that were on God's heart. In seeking to talk God out of carrying out his judgment against the Israelites, Moses mentions several times God's promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In Exodus chapter 32, verse 13, Moses argues, remember your servants, Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, that's the other name for Jacob, to whom you swore by your own self, I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and I will give your descendants all this land that I promised them, and it will be their inheritance forever. Also in Deuteronomy chapter 9, verse 27, Moses relates about that time that he said, remember your servants Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Please overlook the stubbornness of this people, their wickedness and their sin, for the sake of your promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Moses also cared about God's heart for his people, wicked as they were. In Exodus chapter 32, verses 10, and also the last part of verse 12, he keeps emphasizing God's special relationship with them, asking, first of all, why should your anger burn against your people, whom you brought out of Egypt with a great power and a mighty hand? And he urges God, turn from your fierce anger, relent, and do not bring disaster on your people. In Deuteronomy 9, verse 29, again recounting this, he says to the people, talking to God, this is what I said to God, but they are your people, your inheritance that you brought out by your great power and by your outstretched arm. In a positive example in Exodus chapter 33, verse 13, when Moses asked God to teach him God's ways so that he could teach them to the people, Moses adds, remember, Lord, this nation is your people. In fact, so important did he know that God's people were to God, that Moses says to God in Exodus chapter 32, verse 32, but now, please forgive their sins. But if not, then blot me out of the book that you have written. He didn't look out for himself. He said, God, you care about these people. If you're going to wipe them out, then I want to be wiped out as well. Moses cared about God's promises and about God's people, two things that were very important to God. Finally, Moses cared about God's presence. He cared about his promises, his reputation. He cared about the things that were important to God, and he cared about God's presence. In Exodus chapter 33, verse 15, when God told him that because of their sinfulness, he would send an angel to go with them, but he himself would not go with them, Moses says these words, "If your presence does not go with us, do not send us up from here. How will anyone know that you're pleased with me and with your people unless you go with us? What else will distinguish me and your people from all the people on the face of the earth?" That's the kind of friendship that Moses had with God. But I want to look at one other aspect. There are two telling characteristics about Moses himself that I believe are also instructive for us if we want to be friends of God. What stands out about Moses in all of these texts, first of all, is his humility. In Numbers chapter 12, when Moses' own sister Miriam and his own brother Aaron tried to stage a coup of sorts against Moses, Moses did not meet pride with pride. He didn't even argue with them. And in the parentheses in verse 3, we're told, "Now Moses was a very humble man, more humble than anyone else on the face of the earth." God himself ultimately steps in this passage and stands up for Moses, judging Miriam, who started the whole thing. But even when God does so, Moses pleads with God on Miriam's behalf. So humble is he, crying out in verse 13 when she's struck with leprosy, "Please, God, heal her." What humility it takes, not only not to attack someone who has attacked us, but to go even further and pray for those who despitefully seek to criticize us. And this was long before Jesus commanded us to pray for those who despitefully use you. The other characteristic that stands out about Moses is the fact that he was so teachable. Not only did he ask God to teach me your ways in Exodus 33, verse 13, but he was also open to be taught by his father-in-law at a time when he was already the leader of several million people. How many leaders of several million people do you know who would be willing to listen to somebody else? When you're a close friend of someone who is very important, it can be easy to become haughty and proud. But not Moses. When Jethro came to visit him in the wilderness and offered both correction and advice to Moses, Moses, we're told in Exodus chapter 18, verse 24, listened to his father-in-law and did everything he said. And God used it to bless Moses' leadership. If we are willing to follow Moses' example, spending time alone with God and genuinely caring about his presence, his reputation, and the things that are most important to him, if we're willing to do that, walking in humility with him and with others, with a teachable spirit, then we too will likely discover what it is to be a true friend of God. And that is the good news.